Hello, welcome to the Southern Bible Thumper channel. The purpose of this account is to gain concrete understanding of the Bible by specifying God's commands and distinguishing them from additional information, traditions, or recommendations from other speakers in the Bible. This will help us learn discernment, gain clarity, and enhance our critical thinking skills. Knowing what God expects from us and getting into the habit of asking God what to do with the information in the Bible that is not a command from Him will strengthen our personal relationships with God. One example I hear often being used as a command from God is 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34. This is not a command from God. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. I have heard this cited over and over again as a command, as it being in the Bible. But when you look at the beginning of this chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we see that this is Paul speaking, and he's addressing the church of Corinth. So while this man of God is speaking, he's speaking from chapter 1 to chapter 14. So God didn't say this. Paul said this. This would fall under that information that is not a direct command from God, but it's information that we should go to God with and ask, okay, how should we apply this to our lives since this is not a command from you? To help make this point, I'd like to show you a direct command from God. Exodus chapter 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, the beautiful thing about BibleRef.com is you can click on every verse. You can flip through the entire chapter, reading 7 versions of the same verse on the same page. When we look at Exodus 20, verse 1, we see, and God spoke. God spoke, God spoke, God gave. The difference between the 10 commandments, that is information directly given to us from God. There is no ambivalence. There was no second speaker. God said it. The reason why this is different from what Paul said is because Paul is not God. So because Paul is not God, now we're having someone give his recommendation on how things should be ran in church. So while that might be useful information if we go to God and ask, that is not a direct command from God. And there's a reason why God didn't command it. So that's why we need to go to God and ask him what that reason is. Okay, so for this upload, we are going to be reading 1 Samuel chapter 17. This chapter is 58 verses, so I anticipate this taking me around 8 minutes to read. Now, the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shokah, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shokah and Azekah and Ephesdamim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose weight was 6 cubits in a span. And he had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shema. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp of thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the man of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant keep his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put an helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with the coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. And he took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip, and a sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked out and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword and a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day, and to the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hastened and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine, and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran, and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted, and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley, and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Shaaraim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine, and brought it to Jerusalem, that he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell." And the king said, "Inquire thou whose son this stripling is." And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him, and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said unto him, "Whose son art thou, thou young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." Okay, so as stated earlier, the purpose of this account is to understand the Bible, to understand what God said, and distinguish God's commands from other information in the Bible. Just because something is said in the Bible, just because a speaker recommends something, doesn't mean that that is the same thing as God making a command. God has the ability to be direct, concise. And so if we don't see God doing that, there's a reason why. And what we should do when we approach information that God did not command, we need to go to God and ask, is this something that we should be applying to our lives? Right now, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and the story of David and Goliath happens under King Saul's leadership. Now, King Saul is the second king of Israel, but his story begins in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So that's why I keep coming back here to review. The purpose of this is so that we can understand what happened so far. So, 1 Samuel chapter 8, Israel demands a change in leadership because Samuel's wayward sons were perverting justice. 1 Samuel 9, God chooses Saul to be Israel's new king. Chapter 10, Saul is anointed privately. He also has to participate in a public announcement, and he hides when the ceremony begins, so he's forced to participate. 1 Samuel 11, Saul leads Israel to a successful victory against the Ammonites, again, the inbred descendants of Lot and his daughter in Genesis chapter 19. We have 1 Samuel chapter 12. In a public ceremony, Saul gives Israel an opportunity to voice any grievances. Everyone agrees that Samuel has been a fair leader. 1 Samuel chapter 13. Saul's second year as king, his son Jonathan attacks a Philistine military structure with 1,000 men. The Philistines are outraged. And in this chapter, the people are so terrified that the men who are in the army, they hide. Saul makes an unauthorized offering to God out of fear because he was losing the confidence of the people. 1 Samuel 14. Jonathan and his assistant sneak away to successfully defeat the Philistines. The victory restored courage in the men of Israel. The men who hid in the previous chapter realign themselves with Saul's army, and even the Hebrews that had joined the Philistine army before this incident, they're so inspired by Jonathan's confidence that they joined Saul's army. So in verse 45, the men of Israel credits Jonathan for restoring hope. 1 Samuel 15. This chapter details the information given in 1 Samuel 14:48. So in the previous chapter, it ends with Saul going to war with multiple people, but the Amalekites in particular are explored in this chapter. So the Amalekites are Esau's offspring in Genesis 36. Um, Saul was disobedient. He allowed the Amalekite king to live. Samuel is angry. He cuts the king to pieces and refuses to visit Saul again. And God regrets making Saul king. 1 Samuel 16. God tells Samuel to go to Bethlehem to anoint a new king to avoid suspicion from Saul. God advises Samuel to bring a cow to make a burnt offering in Bethlehem. God leads Samuel to invite Jesse and asks him to introduce his sons. God reveals David to be the new king, and Saul anoints him. Saul begins to suffer an affliction that his servants determine is an evil spirit from God. David is employed as Saul's harp player, and David has a reputation as a skilled musician. David's music relieves King Saul of his ailment. So now that we are in 1 Samuel chapter 17, remember that in the previous chapter, David was employed by King Saul's uh, house. So 1 Samuel 17. The Philistines and the Israelites prepare camps with the intent of warring with each other again. Goliath, the Philistine, was a giant man with a long history of being a capable warrior. He was challenging Israel to fight him. Israel was terrified. King Saul and David's older brothers go to war while David tends to his father's sheep. Jesse, David's father, tells David to deliver food to his brothers. When he hears about the reward, and heard Goliath's taunts, David believes he can defeat Goliath and tells Saul. Saul gives David his approval. David uses a smooth stone and a slingshot to hit Goliath in the head, knocking him over. David takes Goliath's sword and cuts off his head. The Philistines retreat, and Israel pillages valuables from their camp. David brings Goliath's head to Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 17. In preparation for war, the Philistines and the Israelites make two campsites with a valley in between them. The Philistines have a champion fighter, Goliath, who is described as being a huge man. When we look at verses 4 and 5, the wonderful thing about Bible Ref, you can click on a verse and see 7 translations on the screen at the same time. When we look at the Christian Standard Bible translation, we see that Goliath was 9 feet tall. When we look at verse 5, we see that his armor weighed about 125 pounds. So this is just letting you know. When we get to verse 7, we also see his spear, the head of his spear weighed 15 pounds. And he also had a shield bearer walking in front of him. So, in addition to being 9 feet tall, being clothed head to toe with armor, and having a giant weapon, he still needs someone in front of him who is armed, walking in front of him. Still needs protection a little bit. Doesn't have quite the same level of confidence. Isn't that like life, though? Person who seems to have all they need on earth, but that intangible confidence, they got everything but the confidence, though. Okay, verses 8 through 9. Goliath taunts Israel, telling Israel to send me a man to fight. He says, if you win, Israel, the Philistines will serve you. But if we win, you will serve us. Verse 11. King Saul and Israel were afraid. Jesse's three eldest sons follows King Saul to battle. That's what this is saying from verse 12 to his three eldest were in battle. David stayed behind to take care of the sheep. For 40 days, Goliath came out and taunted Israel in this manner, shouting at them. David's father Jesse tells him, take your brothers some cheese, bread, and grain, and then see how your brothers are doing. When we get to 19, verse 19 to 23, in the midst of battle, David approaches his brothers on the campsite. Goliath runs up to the camp, and Israel flees from him. And they begin to talk. Have you seen this man? Anyone who can defeat him, King Saul will give his daughter in marriage to that man. He'll also make sure that he's rich. David said, word. David confirms, wow, is this what you get if you can resolve this issue? And they tell him yes, or bet. uh, verse 28. And this made me smile when I was reading it because his older brother gets mad at him. His older brother gets mad at him. What are you doing here? You're just being nosy. And David says, well, what have I done now? All I was doing is talking. So David turns away from his brother and he starts talking to the other men. King Saul gets word of this and he sends for David to talk to him. David says, hey, don't let the people around you, don't let their hearts fail. I will go and fight the Philistine. And Saul said, no, you're not. You're a kid. This man has been in battle since he was a kid. And David said, nope. I've kept sheep before, and I had to fight a bear and I had to fight a lion, and I was victorious over both. I understand that I was outmatched in those situations, and because of God, I was victorious. I understand that I'm outmatched in this situation as well, but because I have God, I will prevail in this situation as well. So then Saul says, go, let the Lord be with you. Then Saul tried to give David his armor. David says, I can't move. So he takes them off. Verse 40, he takes his staff and 5 smooth stones with his sling, and he approached. He had the confidence, he approached. And Goliath moved closer to him with his shield bearer in front of him. Again, this man is larger. He's been a man fighting since his youth. He's got all this heavy armor and weapons, and he's still moving to David, who is a child, with some rocks. He still needs a man in front of him. He still isn't confident enough to just one-on-one. Even though he seems to be physically more capable, this story highlights how important confidence in God is. How you can seem to be totally outmatched in a situation, but that confidence. Anyway, the first thing Goliath tries to do, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? I'll give your flesh to the birds. He's trying to get in his head. He's trying to dismantle his confidence. Because if you know that you're clearly capable and no one has come to fight you for 40 days except for this kid, why not just tear him apart and claim victory over Israel? Instead, he hesitates. he wants to make David hesitate too because he's got all this armor, he's taller, and he's got an armor bearer in front of him. So he wants him to get scared too, because you don't even seem scared. You couldn't even move the armor that they gave you to try to protect you. You can't even really get no protection. It won't work for you. David tells Goliath in verses 45 through 47, "You are fully armored with earthly weapons. But me, I'm armored with the name of the Lord of hosts, and you've disrespected that God. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. All the world will know that there's a God in Israel." So, verses 48 through 51, Goliath runs toward David. David famously slings a stone into Goliath's head, which caused him to fall. David was able to remove Goliath's sword. So, remember earlier when Saul tried to give him armor, he couldn't even move the sword, couldn't move the armor? But once he knocked Goliath down, he was able to move his sword. He was able to take his armor. That says something too there. Once Goliath was down, the Philistines fled. David took Goliath's sword because he didn't have a sword. There was no sword in the hand of David. So he cut off Goliath's head, took his armor. The Philistines fled. Israel raided the Philistine camps for valuables because that's what you get when you engage in war. Verses 52 through 53. Okay, no, sorry, I already went through that. So verse 55 through 58. When King Saul saw this, he asked his army commander, "Whose son is this?" And he said, "I don't know." Remember in the previous chapter, David was employed as one of King Saul's staff members, but he doesn't know anything else about him. So now he's asking, "Who is this?" And then Saul asked him, and David said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse." So his job must not be considered extremely important. These are the highlights. Because Saul doesn't know anything about his family. Confidence. Confidence is something that's highlighted in this chapter. It seems that Goliath would have had more confidence and he at least wouldn't have needed a man in front of him. If he was taller, he had all this armor, and he had all this experience. He's clearly more capable on earth. But that intangible nature of confidence, and confidence in the right thing too, it put David over the edge. David was humble enough to understand that he is not capable alone. There's nothing on earth that he has access to that was going to help him in that situation. The armor wasn't going to help him. So all he could do was have confidence in God, and it was victorious. This is a famous story. So I just want to bring up Saul's fearful nature. In chapter 13, he makes a peace offering, hoping to retain Israel's confidence. This is after verse 9, 1 Samuel chapter 9. He hid when he was supposed to be announced as king. Then he makes a peace offering in chapter 13 after his son Jonathan makes the Philistines angry. Chapter 14, Saul asked the priests to bring the ark of the covenant, which we already saw in 1 Samuel chapter 4, that using the ark of the covenant as like it's an advantage without a sincere devotion to God does not help the Israelites win in war. And it was actually against the Philistines again, even in 1 Samuel chapter 4. Um, and then chapter 15, Saul allows Israel to disobey the law that God gave about the Amalekites. In verse 24, he admits to Samuel that he feared the people's voice.